In the hills of northern South Africa and Zimbabwe lives a community that has, for generations, told outsiders the same striking claim, that they are descended from ancient Jewish traders who crossed the Arabian Peninsula thousands of years ago and eventually settled in southern Africa. For decades, historians and anthropologists treated this as an interesting piece of oral tradition, nothing more. Then geneticists actually tested the claim, rigorously, for the very first time. And what they found didn't just support the story, it revealed a genetic thread so specific and so deeply unlikely that it has forced scientists to rethink how far and how deep ancient migrations across the African continent really went, opening up a scientific mystery that took decades, multiple research teams, and increasingly advanced sequencing technology to fully untangle. This is the story of the Lemba people, sometimes referred to in older writing and popular media as South Africa's Black Jews, and the decades-long scientific investigation into whether their oral history was myth, coincidence, or something far more real and far more concrete than anyone initially expected. It's a story that sits at the intersection of genetics, history, colonialism, and faith, and by the end, it becomes clear why researchers describe it as one of the most compelling case studies in the entire field of population genetics, a case that continues to shape how scientists approach questions of ancestry, identity, and oral memory in communities all over the world, from small isolated island populations to mountain communities to groups scattered across multiple continents by centuries of trade, conquest, and migration. Let's start with what the Lemba themselves have always said about who they are. The Lemba are a Bantu-speaking ethnic group numbering somewhere around 80,000 people today, living primarily across parts of South Africa's Limpopo province and neighboring Zimbabwe, with smaller related communities also identified in parts of Malawi and Mozambique over the years. Culturally and linguistically, they resemble their Bantu-speaking neighbors in almost every visible way. They speak the same regional languages as the communities around them, and to an outside observer walking through a Lemba village, there would be little at first glance to distinguish them from any other Bantu-speaking community in the region. Their homes, their farming practices, their clothing, and much of their day-to-day social structure closely mirror those of the surrounding Venda, Shona, and other neighboring communities they have lived alongside for generations. But dig even slightly beneath the surface and the differences start to appear. The Lemba maintain a set of religious and cultural practices that set them apart sharply from their neighbors, practices that, on their own, read almost like a checklist pulled directly from ancient Jewish law. They traditionally avoid eating pork. They practice ritual slaughter of animals in a manner strikingly similar to Jewish kosher slaughter, draining the blood from meat before it can be consumed. Traditionally, Lemba men have practiced circumcision as a religious rite. They observe a form of Sabbath. Many traditional Lemba burial customs echo Jewish burial practices, including specific ways of wrapping and orienting the body. And perhaps most strikingly, Lemba oral tradition describes an ancestral homeland referred to as Sina, located somewhere to the north, from which their ancestors are said to have migrated southward after a long journey that reportedly began even further north, across the sea, from a place their oral traditions associate with ancient Israel or Judea. Some versions of the oral tradition even name specific towns along this ancestral migration route, describing a journey that moved down the eastern coast of Africa over the course of many generations, before turning inland, details that have been passed down through storytelling, song, and ceremony, long before anyone thought to write them down or test them scientifically. For a very long time, this collection of practices and oral traditions was treated by outside researchers as, at best, a curious cultural coincidence, and at worst, a fabricated or borrowed narrative, possibly absorbed through contact with Muslim or Jewish traders who moved along East African trade routes in more recent centuries. Colonial-era anthropologists in the 19th and early 20th century, operating with the racial assumptions common to that era, often outright dismissed the idea that an African population could have any authentic connection to ancient Near Eastern ancestry, treating the practices as imitation rather than inheritance. It's an important piece of context because it shaped how long this question sat unanswered, treated more as folklore than as something worth rigorous scientific investigation. It's a pattern that repeated itself across many parts of the colonized world during that era, where indigenous and African oral histories were routinely filed away as legend, while comparable oral traditions from European societies were often treated as historically meaningful, a double standard that shaped which questions researchers even considered worth asking for the better part of a century. That began to change in the late 20th century, as genetic testing technology advanced to the point where researchers could actually examine the question directly, rather than relying solely on cultural observation and oral history. The specific tool that made this possible was Y-chromosome analysis. Because the Y-chromosome passes almost unchanged from father to son across generations, it acts like a genetic surname, allowing researchers to trace a single unbroken paternal lineage back through deep history, largely unaffected by the mixing that occurs with other parts of the genome each generation. Unlike most of our DNA, which reshuffles and recombines with each new generation, drawing from both parents in a way that blurs specific ancestral signals over time, the Y chromosome passes down almost as a single intact unit, meaning any distinctive mutation present in one man's Y chromosome will show up, essentially unchanged, in his sons, his grandsons, and so on, for dozens of generations, making it an unusually powerful tool for tracing a single paternal line deep into the past. In the 1990s, researchers began comparing Y chromosome markers among Lemba men to markers found in Jewish populations elsewhere in the world, specifically looking at a genetic signature known as the Cohen Modal Haplotype. This particular genetic marker had already been identified in earlier research among men from the Jewish priestly caste, known as Kohanim, who, according to Jewish tradition, are descended in an unbroken paternal line from a single ancestor, the biblical figure Aaron, brother of Moses, a lineage tradition that has been carried forward within Jewish religious practice for well over 2,000 years. Because priestly status in Jewish tradition passes strictly from father to son, researchers reasoned that if this tradition reflected a real, continuous biological lineage, it should be detectable as a shared Y chromosome signature among Jewish men who identify as Kohanim, regardless of which Jewish community around the world they came from, whether Ashkenazi communities in Europe or Sephardic and Mizrahi communities across North Africa and the Middle East. And remarkably, that is exactly what earlier studies had found. A shared paternal genetic signature appearing at strikingly high frequency, specifically among men identifying as Kohanim, cutting across otherwise genetically distinct Jewish populations that had been geographically separated for well over 1,000 years. This was itself a remarkable finding on its own, well before the Lemba were ever tested, because it suggested that an oral tradition of unbroken male priestly descent, something that could easily have been symbolic or purely religious rather than biological, actually corresponded to a real, shared genetic signal across communities that had otherwise diverged enormously after centuries of separate history in different parts of the world. When researchers turned this same genetic lens toward the Lemba, they found something nobody fully expected going in. The Cohen Modal Haplotype showed up among Lemba men at a frequency far higher than random chance could explain. And critically, it appeared at its highest frequency specifically within the Buba clan, the traditional priestly clan within Lemba society, the clan whose members have long held special religious authority and ceremonial responsibility within the community, structurally mirroring the priestly role of the Kohanim within Jewish tradition. Think about how remarkable that alignment actually is. This wasn't simply a case of Lemba people in general showing some elevated frequency of a Near Eastern genetic marker scattered randomly across the population. The marker was concentrated precisely within the one clan that Lemba oral tradition itself identifies as carrying special priestly status, mirroring almost exactly the same internal logic found in Jewish tradition regarding the Kohanim. Researchers involved in the original study described being genuinely startled by how cleanly the genetic data lined up with the internal social structure the Lemba themselves had described to anthropologists decades earlier, well before anyone had thought to test the claim scientifically. A cultural institution that had been passed down orally for generations, entirely independent of any genetic testing, turned out to line up with an actual, measurable genetic signal running through a specific paternal lineage. This is the kind of finding that is genuinely difficult to explain away as coincidence, cultural borrowing, or wishful thinking. Oral traditions can certainly be reshaped, embellished, or influenced by later contact with outside groups. But a documented genetic marker, tracing a specific paternal lineage, concentrated specifically within a clan whose internal social structure independently claims that exact kind of ancestral priestly distinction is a very different kind of evidence. It suggested that somewhere back in history, a group of men carrying this specific genetic lineage entered the ancestral Lemba population, and that lineage was preserved, generation after generation, specifically along the paternal line associated with priestly authority within the community. Of course, this immediately raised a bigger and much harder question. If the genetic evidence pointed toward some kind of ancient Near Eastern paternal contribution to the Lemba population, when did that contribution happen, and how did it actually get there? This is where the deeper historical detective work comes in, piecing together trade routes, migration patterns, and additional genetic evidence to reconstruct a plausible sequence of events. The most widely supported explanation among researchers today involves the ancient and medieval trade networks that connected the Arabian Peninsula to the coast of East Africa. For well over 1,000 years, Arab, and to some extent Jewish, traders operated extensive maritime and overland trade routes running down the eastern coast of Africa, exchanging goods like gold, ivory, and textiles with communities across what is now Yemen, Oman, the East African coast, and further inland. Port towns along the Swahili coast in places like modern-day Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique served for centuries as bustling meeting points where Arabian, Persian, Indian, and African merchants exchanged goods, ideas, and, inevitably, genetic ancestry through intermarriage and long-term settlement. Some of these trading communities, particularly certain Jewish merchant communities that historically operated throughout the region surrounding the Arabian Peninsula and the Horn of Africa, are believed to have established smaller settlements or trading posts along these ancient and well-traveled routes over the centuries. Lemba oral tradition itself describes an ancestral migration beginning from a place across the sea, moving first into the region of the East African coast, and then gradually pushing further inland and southward over subsequent generations, eventually settling in the territory that is now Zimbabwe and South Africa's Limpopo province. This lines up remarkably closely with the broader historical pattern of trade-driven migration and settlement along that coastline, where small groups of outside traders, over the course of many generations, gradually integrated into local Bantu-speaking populations through intermarriage, adopting the language and much of the broader culture of the communities they settled among, while retaining specific religious practices and oral traditions tied to their original ancestry. This is precisely the kind of slow generational blending that leaves almost no trace in the broader archaeological record, since it doesn't involve large armies, conquest, or dramatic population replacement, but instead unfolds quietly over centuries through marriage, trade partnerships, and gradual cultural exchange, which is exactly why genetic evidence has proven so much more revealing here than traditional historical or archaeological methods alone. This kind of gradual cultural integration, where a small founding population is absorbed into a much larger surrounding community linguistically and culturally, while still preserving certain distinct practices and a documented paternal genetic signature, is actually a well-documented pattern seen in numerous historical migrations around the world. It explains why the Lemba speak Bantu languages and share so much cultural material with their neighbors, while still maintaining these specific practices and an unusual concentrated genetic marker among the men in their priestly clan. It's worth pausing here to address a common misunderstanding about what this genetic evidence does and does not prove. Finding the Cohen Modal Haplotype among the Lemba does not mean that the entire Lemba population is genetically Jewish in some broad sense, nor does it mean their overall genome closely resembles that of modern Jewish populations around the world. Broader genome-wide studies of the Lemba, examining ancestry across the entire genetic code, rather than just the single paternal lineage traced through the Y-chromosome, show that the overwhelming majority of Lemba ancestry is, unsurprisingly, closely related to neighboring Bantu-speaking populations across southern Africa. This makes complete sense given the documented history of the group. A relatively small number of male traders, carrying a specific paternal lineage, integrating into and marrying within a much larger existing Bantu-speaking population over many centuries. Genetically speaking, this is very similar to patterns seen in other parts of the world, where small groups of male traders or migrants settled among much larger existing populations, contributing a detectable but numerically modest fraction of overall ancestry, while their descendants gradually adopted the language, farming practices, and broader culture of their new home. This distinction between a specific paternal lineage and overall genome-wide ancestry is one that even experienced researchers sometimes have to explain carefully to journalists and the public, because it's easy for the nuance to get lost in translation. A single Y-chromosome marker, however striking, represents just one branch of an enormous, ever-widening family tree. Every person carries thousands of ancestors as you go back far enough in time, and any one paternal line, traced through fathers and sons alone, represents only a tiny sliver of that much larger ancestral picture. What makes the Lemba case so compelling isn't that it rewrites their entire ancestry, but that it identifies one specific, well-preserved thread within it, a thread that happens to align precisely with what their own oral tradition had claimed for generations. What the Y-chromosome evidence specifically demonstrates is a distinct, traceable paternal thread within that broader ancestry, concentrated specifically within the clan that Lemba tradition itself identifies as holding priestly status. It's a narrow but remarkably precise piece of evidence, and understanding exactly what it does and doesn't show is essential to interpreting the finding responsibly, rather than either overstating it or dismissing it entirely. Since those early studies in the 1990s and early 2000s, researchers have continued refining this picture using increasingly sophisticated genetic tools. More recent studies incorporating broader Y-chromosome haplogroup analysis, alongside comparative data from a wider range of populations across the Arabian Peninsula, the Middle East, and East Africa, have worked to narrow down more precisely where, geographically and historically, this paternal lineage most likely entered the Lemba population, and roughly how long ago that contact likely occurred. While researchers continue to debate the exact timeline, the general consensus places this genetic contribution somewhere within the last 1,000 to 2,000 years, consistent with the broader historical window during which Arabian and East African trade networks were most active. Some researchers place the most likely period of contact somewhere between the 8th and 15th centuries, an era when Arab and Persian trading settlements were firmly established along the Swahili coast, though others argue the evidence could support an even earlier window, and refining that timeline remains an active area of ongoing research. Some more recent genetic work has also expanded beyond the Cohen Modal Haplotype specifically, examining other Y-chromosome markers found among Lemba men that are also associated with populations from the Near East and Arabian Peninsula more broadly, not exclusively linked to Jewish populations. This has led some researchers to propose a more nuanced picture, that the ancestral contribution to Lemba paternal lineages may reflect a broader wave of Near Eastern and Arabian trader ancestry entering the population, within which a specific subset happened to carry the particular lineage associated with Jewish priestly ancestry, rather than the entire founding group being drawn from a single, exclusively Jewish source population. This more nuanced picture doesn't diminish the significance of the original finding, so much as it adds texture and realism to it, replacing a simple, singular origin story with something closer to how migration and settlement usually actually happened historically: messy, gradual, and made up of multiple overlapping waves of contact rather than one clean, isolated event. This kind of refinement is exactly how good science is supposed to work. The initial striking discovery of the Cohen Modal Haplotype among the Lemba opened the door to a much deeper and more careful investigation, and as more data has come in, researchers have been able to build an increasingly detailed and nuanced picture rather than simply confirming or rejecting the original oral tradition in a simple yes or no fashion. The honest scientific answer sits somewhere in between the two extremes that dominated the conversation for so long, more complicated and more interesting than either the old dismissive colonial-era skepticism or a simplified, uncomplicated confirmation of the oral tradition exactly as told. It's a reminder that real historical questions rarely resolve into the kind of clean, satisfying answer that makes for an easy headline, and that the most rigorous, honest science often produces exactly this kind of layered, partially resolved picture, one that keeps refining itself as new evidence and better tools become available. What makes the Lemba case so significant within the broader field of population genetics goes beyond just this one community's remarkable history. It stands as one of the clearest examples anywhere in the world of oral tradition, maintained across many generations with no access to genetic science, turning out to align closely with an actual, measurable genetic signal once modern tools became available to test it. For a community that spent so long having their history dismissed or treated with skepticism by outside academics, the genetic evidence has offered a significant form of validation, demonstrating that their traditional understanding of their own ancestry, far from being invented or borrowed, appears to be rooted in a real and traceable historical migration. It also offers a broader lesson for how researchers approach oral traditions and origin stories from communities around the world. For much of the history of anthropology and genetics as fields, oral traditions from non-European or indigenous communities were frequently treated with far less credibility than written historical records from European societies, often dismissed as legend or myth without serious investigation. The Lemba case stands as a clear demonstration of why that approach was often deeply flawed. An oral tradition, carefully preserved across dozens of generations, turned out to encode a genuinely accurate memory of a real ancestral migration, one that modern genetic science was eventually able to independently verify using entirely different methods and evidence. It's worth sitting with how unusual that kind of confirmation actually is in the broader study of human history. Most oral traditions, even carefully preserved ones, blur, drift, and change over dozens of generations, absorbing details from later contact, reshaping themselves to fit changing circumstances, or losing specificity over time. For a tradition to remain accurate enough, across possibly 1,000 years or more of purely verbal, generation-to-generation transmission, to be independently confirmed by a completely unrelated scientific method centuries later, is a genuinely remarkable testament to the strength of Lemba oral culture and the seriousness with which that history was preserved and passed down. Elders within the community traditionally held responsibility for accurately passing down this history to the next generation, often through structured storytelling and ceremony rather than casual retelling, a formalized system of oral transmission not unlike the way many ancient societies preserved important religious and historical knowledge before the widespread availability of writing, and one that appears, at least in this case, to have preserved genuinely accurate historical detail across an impressively long stretch of time. This has encouraged researchers working with other communities around the world who maintain similar origin stories involving distant ancestral migrations to take those oral traditions more seriously as a starting point for genetic investigation rather than dismissing them outright. It has, in a real sense, changed the working assumptions of an entire field. Where earlier generations of anthropologists might have approached an unusual origin story with automatic skepticism, Researchers today are far more likely to treat such claims as testable hypotheses worth genuine investigation, precisely because cases like the Lemba have demonstrated how often these traditions turn out to carry real historical weight. Around the world, numerous communities maintain oral histories describing ancestral migrations from distant regions, connections to specific ancient peoples, or shared origins with groups located thousands of kilometers away. The Lemba case demonstrates that at least some of these traditions may indeed encode real, verifiable historical migrations, passed down with far more accuracy across many generations than researchers previously assumed possible for purely oral transmission. This shift in perspective has had ripple effects well beyond any single community's history. It has encouraged a broader reevaluation of how much credibility oral history deserves as a starting point for scientific inquiry, rather than being treated as secondary to written records or dismissed outright when it comes from communities without a strong written historical tradition of their own. There's also something worth noting about how the Lemba themselves have engaged with this scientific research over the years. Rather than treating the genetic findings as an external validation imposed from outside, many within the Lemba community have actively participated in and welcomed the research, viewing it as a meaningful confirmation of a heritage that outsiders had long questioned or dismissed. Some Lemba community leaders and religious figures have engaged directly with international Jewish organizations and religious authorities in the years since these findings were published, exploring questions of religious recognition and connection to broader global Jewish communities, discussions that continue in various forms today, reflecting the ongoing and evolving relationship between this remarkable genetic discovery and the lived religious and cultural identity of the Lemba people themselves. These exchanges have not always been simple or straightforward. Questions of religious recognition within Jewish law involve considerations that go well beyond genetic ancestry alone, and different Jewish communities and religious authorities around the world hold varying positions on what recognition would actually require. For the Lemba, navigating these conversations has meant balancing a deep respect for their own centuries-old traditions and community structures with an interest, shared by at least some within the community, in strengthening formal ties to the wider global Jewish community whose ancient priestly lineage their own DNA appears to echo. Some Lemba individuals have pursued formal conversion processes to align more fully with mainstream Jewish religious practice, while others maintain their traditional Lemba religious identity, viewing their Jewish ancestry as one significant thread within a broader, distinctly Lemba cultural and spiritual identity that has developed its own character over the centuries since that original ancestral migration. It's also worth taking a moment to consider just how difficult this kind of research actually is to carry out responsibly. Working with any community's ancestry and identity requires a level of care and sensitivity that goes well beyond simply collecting DNA samples and running them through a sequencer. Researchers involved in the various Lemba studies over the years have had to navigate complex questions of consent, cultural sensitivity, and the potential impact their findings could have on a community that had already spent generations having its own history questioned and dismissed by outsiders. Getting this kind of research right means working closely and respectfully with community leaders, clearly explaining what genetic testing can and cannot reveal, and being careful not to overstate conclusions in ways that could be misused to make sweeping claims about identity that the data doesn't actually support. The Lemba research is often cited today as a reasonably strong example of this kind of careful, collaborative approach to sensitive genetic history, precisely because researchers took the time to work with the community, rather than simply extracting data and publishing conclusions without that ongoing dialogue. It's important to approach this entire story with the appropriate scientific caution, avoiding the temptation to treat a genetic marker as a simple, definitive stamp of identity. Ancestry, culture, and religious identity are complicated, multi-layered things, shaped by far more than any single genetic marker traced along one narrow paternal lineage. The Cohen Modal Haplotype tells us something real and significant about a specific thread of Lemba ancestral history, but it doesn't on its own settle every question about identity, belonging, or religious status, questions that involve cultural, religious, and personal dimensions well beyond what population genetics alone can address. It's a distinction that matters not just for the Lemba, but for how we think about ancestry testing and genetic research more broadly. In an era where consumer DNA testing has made genetic ancestry information more accessible than ever before, it often flattens deeply complex questions of identity and belonging into a simple percentage breakdown or a single highlighted result. The Lemba case is a useful reminder that a genetic marker, however striking, is one piece of evidence within a much larger, richer human story, not a complete substitute for it. What the decades of research into the Lemba does offer, though, is a genuinely rare and compelling case where a community's own understanding of its ancestry, maintained through oral tradition alone for centuries, turned out to align remarkably closely with hard genetic evidence once modern science finally caught up enough to test it properly. It's stands as a powerful reminder that the deep history of human migration is written not only in ancient texts and archaeological sites, but sometimes quietly preserved within a community's own stories, waiting for the right scientific tools to come along and confirm what the people telling those stories had understood about themselves all along. And this raises a question that researchers are now actively pursuing in other parts of the world. If oral tradition among the Lemba turned out to encode a real, traceable genetic history spanning well over 1,000 years, how many other communities around the globe, with similarly persistent origin stories describing distant ancestral migrations, might be carrying comparable genetic evidence that simply hasn't been investigated yet with the same rigor applied to the Lemba case? Researchers have already begun applying similar Y-chromosome and broader genomic approaches to other communities with comparable oral traditions of distant ancestral origins, and at least one such investigation, focused on a community on an entirely different continent claiming a similarly ancient and unexpected migration story, has recently returned results that researchers describe as even more surprising than what was found among the Lemba. A story we'll be exploring in detail very soon, one that takes this same combination of oral tradition and genetic detective work to a completely different corner of the world, and turns up an answer that even seasoned researchers have described as one of the more unexpected findings of their careers.